Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, we are going to learn about the general introduction of motor system and the descending tracts. We'll cover this topic under introduction, motor cortex, descending tracts which comprises of corticospinal tract, cortico-rubrospinal tract, reticulospinal tract and vestibulospinal tract. So coming to the general introduction, as you can see here, the main function of our motor system is to contract muscles and to cause movement or to cause some action. So how does it performs? By the help of sending signal from the brain through the neurons to the muscles. So the general function of motor system, motor part of central nervous system is to send signals to the muscle so that they can contract, send impulse or send action potential to the muscle so that they contract and thus causes the movement or the resultant output. This motor system is divided into various systems. Let us say this motor system, the main part or the starting part is the descending system, which is also called as upper motor neuron. What is this descending system? In certain areas of the brain, for example the motor cortex and the another part the brain stem, which consists of the midbrain, pons and medulla. So these areas of the brain contains cell bodies. As we have already discussed, the main functional unit of central nervous system is neurons, which is made up of cell body, dendrites, axons and terminal end buttons. The cell body of the neurons lies on these portions. Let it be the motor cortex or let it be the brainstem areas. From there the cell body, from these areas where the cell body is located, arises the neuron axons, the axons of the neuron, and then this sends the axon downwards to the spinal cord, where it forms the second aspect of our motor system, that is called the local circuit of neurons. Here as you can see, this part in the spinal cord is the local circuit of the neurons. This is a much simpler representation of more complex circuitry which is present in the spinal cord. Then comes the third aspect, that is motor neuron pool, or which is called as lower motor neuron. This motor neuron pool is the pool of motor neurons which are coming out of the spinal cord. These are also called as alpha motor neuron or the final common pathway, because the effect of all the brain, motor cortex, brainstem areas finally affect this pathway, which is the ultimate single pathway to come to the muscle. That is why it is called as the final common pathway, or also called as lower motor neuron. So this pool of alpha motor neuron then gives the impulse to the muscles, and then the muscle, once they get impulse, once they get action potential, they contract. In this circuitry there is also contribution of the sensory inputs. So as you can see, this sensation, when it comes, it goes to the brain as well. It contributes to form a circuit with the motor output also. And then there is role of certain other brain areas apart from the motor cortex and brainstem areas. There are role of other brain areas like basal ganglia and cerebellum to control the motor function of the central nervous system. What is the role of basal ganglia? It is gating the proper initiation of the movements. So basal ganglia is responsible for initiation of the movement, and cerebellum is responsible for the sensory motor coordination. That means whether the command which has given to the muscle, it is performed properly or not, is sensed by the cerebellum, and then if any correction is to be made, the cerebellum is the one which is responsible to give the signal to the brain that the correction has to be made. So these are the important aspects or important things what you need to understand, the basic building blocks of the motor system. Once again, it consists of descending system, which is the neurons coming from the central nervous system to the spinal cord. So the descending system, the cell bodies lies on the motor cortex or on the brain stem, and then from there they send the axons down to the spinal cord, which comprises the this axons or these neurons are called as the upper motor neuron. Very important to memorize, understand what is upper motor neuron, because uh, when we learn about the lesions of upper motor neuron in the future, it will be important to understand what is upper motor neuron and what is lower motor neuron. Then these neurons, once they come to the spinal cord, they form a local circuitry, as you can see here, and this local circuitry then initiates impulse in the motor neuron pool. This alpha motor neuron, which is coming out from the anterior horn of the spinal cord, is the lower motor neuron, and then it innervates the muscle. Then there is a sensory input which not only supplies to the brain but also contributes to the circuitry in the motor neuron. And then there is role of other brain areas apart from the motor areas, that is basal ganglia for initiation of movement and cerebellum for coordination of movements. So let us start with the motor cortex. Motor cortex is divided into certain individual areas. Those areas are the primary motor cortex, premotor area, supplementary motor area, and the specialized areas for special functions in the motor cortex. Coming to the primary motor cortex, as you can see here, the central sulcus. Anterior to the central sulcus lies the frontal lobe, and the posterior one third of this frontal lobe consists of the motor cortex. So central sulcus, anterior to central sulcus is the frontal lobe, and the posterior one third part of the frontal lobe, this area comprises the motor cortex. As you can see here, the motor cortex, anterior to the central sulcus lies the motor cortex, one third of the posterior aspect of the frontal lobe. You can see both side of the motor cortex, the left side and the right side. What is primary motor area? The primary motor area is the one which has, when stimulated, it activates a pattern of movement or a group of neurons in the spinal cord so that it generates a pattern of movement. As you can see here, this primary motor area consists of Brodmann's area number 4, and it has various representations in this area. As you can see here, mouth, face, hands, arms, trunk. What is this? What does this means? This means that in this area lies the cell body of the neurons which are supplying the muscles of the mouth, face, hands, arm and trunk. So let us say, if in this area of the primary motor cortex, if we stimulate this area, here the cell body of the neurons which are supplying the muscles in the mouth are present for movement of tongue, for articulation, the or for mastication, the muscles, the cell bodies of these neurons are present. So when we stimulate this area, what will happen? The cell body will get action potential. That action potential will be then traveled through the descending tract to the local neuronal circuitry. From there the local from there the final common pathway or the lower motor neuron will be then stimulated, and that will supply to the muscles, and then it will give action potential to the muscle and will cause contraction of those muscles. That is why the stimulation of this area will cause the movement of the mouth. So understood what is in this area? This in the area in this area of the primary cortex, there lies the cell bodies of the neurons which are supplying to these muscles. As you can see, this is called as homunculus, motor homunculus. That means the representation of areas which are being supplied, the representation of the body parts which are being supplied by these areas of the primary motor cortex. As you can see, the major part of the primary motor cortex is involved in the control of mouth, face, and the distal part of the hands, that is our palms and distal muscle of the hands, and a minor area is for the rest of the body. That means the primary motor cortex is having the responsibility for the more precise and controlled movement of mouth and hands to perform the discrete function, to perform the small minute detailed movements. So as you can see again, the various lips, face, eyelids, brow, neck, thumb, index finger, that means there lies the cell bodies of the neurons which are supplying these individual portion, and if we stimulate these portion, it will cause a pattern of movement. So it's not that the stimulation causes single the contraction of a single muscle, but here lies the pattern of movement. That means it stimulates a group of muscle which ultimately causes a pattern of movement of the muscle. Now coming to the premotor and supplementary motor area. Anterior to the primary motor cortex, 2 to 3 centimeters anterior to the primary motor cortex, lies the premotor area, and above this premotor area lies the supplementary motor area. There are different roles of premotor area. As compared to the primary motor cortex, which is mostly responsible for discrete movements, for the specialized, for the minute fine movements in the distal portion of our hands, and the minute movements in our mouth, and for other minute movements. As compared to that, the premotor area is responsible for a complex movement. It sets a attitude or a posture which forms the basis or which forms the support system, so that the movement, the fine movement from the primary motor cortex can take place. So whenever we are performing a fine movements, the postural what is to be maintained which helps to perform that fine movement is set by the primary motor area. And there is also a specialized function of primary motor area is called the mirror neurons. That means the mirror neurons are the one neurons which helps a person to imitate the actions of other person, or let us say by hearing the instructions the person can imitate the action, or by seeing a person the individual can imitate the action of other person, which helps in learning of certain skills like playing the music instrument or performing a certain function. That is the function of the mirror neurons of premotor area. So that is one specialized function of the premotor area. So in a summary, premotor area is responsible for complex movements which give rise to the posture or attitude which is necessary as a background to perform the fine movements, and also there is a mirror neurons which helps to imitate the action and which helps in learning by seeing or by listening the instructions. Then coming to the supplementary motor area. In the supplementary motor area also lies the discrete the complex pattern of movement which also is responsible for the attitudinal function. Just as it is present in the premotor area, supplementary motor area is also responsible for complex movement which is responsible for the maintenance of background posture. In this premotor and the supplementary area lies their individual homunculus. That means these areas, the representation of various body parts are present in the primary motor cortex. Same will be present individually in the premotor area also and in the supplementary motor area also. These representation will be present individually in these both areas of their own. So that is the function of premotor and supplementary motor area. And there are certain specialized areas in the brain also, like the Broca's area, which is responsible for word formation. That means it is responsible for articulation of words. If this area is damaged, the formation of the word is difficult. The person can only say a small word. The continuous formation of sentence is difficult. The speaking out of sentence will be difficult. Then comes the eye movement, which is this area of contralateral eye movement. It is responsible for fixation of eye on a particular object and then moving to the different objects in the field of vision. So this is the area responsible for eye movement. If there is a damage, the fixation of eye to the different objects in the visual field is not proper. Then comes the area of head rotation, which is responsible for rotation of the head, and hand skill, that is the fine motor action of the hand. These are the specialized areas which help in the special important functions which from the brain. Now coming to our main topic, that is the descending tracts. This descending tracts, as we have already studied, are the tracts which are arising from the motor cortex and the brain stem. Various parts of the brain stem are divided into two classifications, are divided by two different types of classifications. First classification divides them into pyramidal and extrapyramidal tract. What are the pyramidal and extrapyramidal tract? So the descending tracts which are passing through the pyramid of the medulla, this is this white portion or the yellow portion, what you can see here is the pyramid of the medulla, and any tract which passes down to the spinal cord through this pyramid is called the pyramidal tract. And in the case of human beings, in our body, only the corticospinal tract passes through the pyramid. So the corticospinal tract is called pyramidal tracts, and all the other descending tracts like rubrospinal tract, the reticulospinal tract, the vestibulospinal tract, all other tracts which are descending to the spinal cord without contributing to the pyramid of the medulla will be called as extrapyramidal tracts. So pyramidal is corticospinal tract, and apart from this corticospinal, all the other tracts which are descending, which does not takes part in the formation of pyramid, is called the extrapyramidal tracts, which includes the cortico-rubrospinal tract, rubro-corticospinal tract, the vestibulospinal tract, and the uh, reticulospinal tract. So these are the extrapyramidal tracts. This was an older classification which is not used currently. So the current classification is of lateral motor system and the medial motor system. As you can see in this diagram, that the the lower motor neurons which are supplying, this is the cross section of the spinal cord. This is the gray matter of the spinal cord, and there lies, in this gray matter lies the cell body of the neurons which supply to the muscles. So these are the area where the cell body of lower motor neurons or final common pathway are present, and from these cell bodies arises the axons of neurons which supply to the directly to the end muscle. And as you can see in our body part, the distal end or the lateral end is situated laterally in the spinal cord. The cell bodies of the neurons which supply to the distal group of muscles like our fingers, palm, are situated laterally in the gray matter. And as we go medially, the cell bodies of the neurons which supply to the proximal muscles and the axial muscles are situated medially. As you would have understood that the lateral portion of this gray matter, anterior gray horn, is responsible for the for the movement of distal muscles, and the medial portion of this anterior gray horn is responsible for the proximal contraction of the proximal and the axial or the muscles which maintains the posture, axial muscles and the proximal muscles. So the descending tracts which supply to the neurons, the cell body of the neurons which are located laterally are called the lateral motor system. Once again, the descending tract which descends and supply to the distal muscles which are located laterally in the spinal cord are called lateral motor system, whereas the descending tracts which supply to the muscles which are supplied by the neurons present medially in the spinal cord are called the medial motor system. So as we can see, the lateral motor system, the corticospinal tract and the rubrocorticospinal tract supplies to the distal muscle by their supply to the cell body of these neurons which are present laterally in the spinal cord. That is why they are called lateral motor system, because they are supplying to the lateral part of the anterior horn. And the other tracts like the vestibulospinal tract and the reticulospinal tract, they are responsible, and the anterior corticospinal tract, they are responsible for the contraction of proximal and axial group of muscles, and the nerve supplying to them, the cell body, is located medially in the spinal cord, in the anterior horn of the spinal cord medially. So that is why these descending neurons or these descending system are called medial motor system. So the descending tracts which supply to the lateral axons which are responsible for contraction of these distal group of muscles are called lateral motor system, which includes lateral corticospinal tract and rubrocorticospinal tract. And the descending tracts which supply to the cell bodies presenting medially, which ultimately contracts the proximal and axial group of muscles, are called medial motor system, and they include the anterior corticospinal tract, the vestibulospinal tract and the reticulospinal tract. So this is the classification which is used currently, the lateral motor system and the medial motor system. Now coming to the corticospinal tract, as we have already studied, the corticospinal tract is one of the major descending tract which arise from the motor cortex. This is the part of the pyramidal system as in older classification, and in newer classification it has the major contribution to the lateral motor system. So as we can see, it is arising, the corticospinal tracts arise from the motor cortex as well as from the somatosensory cortex. 30% of its neuron, the cell body of 30% of its neuron is situated in the primary motor cortex. 30% of its neuron is coming from the premotor and the supplementary motor areas, and rest 40% of the neurons is coming from the somatosensory areas. That means the axons which forms this corticospinal tract, the cell body of these axons are located, 30% of these axons are 30% of these axons are coming from the cell bodies located in the primary motor area, 30% are coming from the premotor and supplementary area, and rest 40% is coming from the somatosensory cortex, which is posterior to the central sulcus. So this is from where the cell bodies are located, from where the axons are arising. Now these fan like structure from where the axons are arising and coming to a formation of tract. Tract is what? The term tract means a bundle of neurons, the bundle of axons. So the formation of tracts occurs here, and this fan like structure, the fanning like structure, is called corona radiata. Now this, once the tract is formed, it passes through the internal capsule, the posterior portion of the internal capsule, in between the caudate and the putamen nucleus. This internal capsule is important to remember because in case of stroke, the blood supply to the internal capsule is restricted, and what happens is the major damage to this tract occurs in if there is the blood supply to the internal capsule is restricted, because the fibers of the corticospinal tract are densely packed here in the internal capsule. The damage to the internal capsule will damage the corticospinal tract majorly. It will affect more severely. In this corona radiata, if any lesion is there, it will only involve certain small group of neurons. But if any lesion is present in the internal capsule due to stroke, the function of corticospinal tract will suffer more. Now after the internal capsule, it enters the brain stem, where it gives rise to the corticobulbar tracts. We'll study later what are the corticobulbar tracts. Then it goes into the pons and medulla, and in medulla it forms the pyramid, as you can see here, and it at the lower part of the medulla it crosses over to the other side. There the crossing over occurs. That is why we say the left part of our brain controls the right part of our body, and the right part of our brain controls the left part of our body. It is because of this crossover that the left part is responsible for the right part of our body. After crossing over, they descend in the spinal cord. Here also they will called as the corticospinal tract, and they will supply to the local neuronal circuitry. As we have studied before, they will supply to the local neuronal circuitry, which will then give rise to the lower motor neuron and supply the motor end plate. Now one important aspect to see here is this corticospinal tracts crosses over. Few fibers does not cross over to the opposite side in the lower part of medulla. The one which crosses over is called the lateral corticospinal tract, because it travels in the spinal cord laterally. Because it travels in the spinal cord laterally, it is called as corticospinal tract, and it is the major neurons for the lateral motor system. Whereas certain fibers, few less number of fibers, does not crosses to the opposite side in the medulla and descends on the same side anteriorly in the spinal cord. Anteriorly in the spinal cord. These fibers are called anterior corticospinal tracts. So corticospinal tracts divides into two parts, majorly in the lateral corticospinal tract, and few fibers which does not crosses over in the lower medulla forms the anterior corticospinal tract. These anterior corticospinal tract eventually crosses over to the opposite side in the cervical or the thoracic region of the spinal cord. As you can see, the anterior and lateral corticospinal tract, the lateral corticospinal tract travels laterally. The tract is located laterally in the spinal cord, whereas the anterior corticospinal tract is located anteriorly in the spinal cord. Then it gives rise to the neurons, to the local neuronal circuitry, from where arises the final common pathway. From this local neuronal circuitry arises the final common pathway, alpha motor fibers. So this is how lateral and anterior corticospinal tract is present. Now there are other fibers also arising from the cortex which are important to be understood, because these are the other supplies from the cortex, from the motor cortex to different areas. So let us enumerate one by one what are the other fibers from the cortex. The other fibers apart from corticospinal tracts arising from motor cortex are the short collaterals back to the cortex. What are their function? It inhibits the surrounding areas, and because of that inhibition it sharpens the, or it manages the contraction of a muscle sharply. That means the particular group of muscles only will get stimulated without stimulation of surrounding muscles, which will disturb the fine movement. So that is why the collaterals which inhibits the other area of the cortex, the surrounding area of the cortex, makes the signal sharp and helps in only the stimulation of that fine particular pattern of movement. Second is it sends the signal to caudate nucleus and putamen. The caudate nucleus and putamens are the part of basal ganglia. So basal ganglia, as we have studied, it is another area of the brain which is responsible for initiation of movement. That is why this caudate nucleus, the supply to the caudate nucleus and putamen, is responsible for activation of basal ganglia, which further helps in the initiation of the movement. Then the corticospinal tracts give its signal to the red nucleus. The red nucleus is the place from where the rubrocorticospinal tract is arising. As we will study further, the next descending tract will be the rubrocorticospinal tract. So there is the cortical supply to this red nucleus also, which then stimulates the rubrospinal tract. Then there is supply to the reticular and vestibular nuclei also. As we have studied before, that another descending tracts from the brain stems are the reticulospinal tract and the vestibulospinal tract, which are arising from the reticular and the vestibular nuclei. So the cortex also supplies to these nuclei. So as you can see, other descending tracts are indirectly supplied by the cortex, and it is also supplying to the pontine nuclei. The function of this pontine nuclei is it sends the input to the cerebellum. So cerebellum is another part which helps in coordination of movement. So the signals from the cortex through pontine nucleus goes to the cerebellum and helps in the action of cerebellum. So as you can see, there are direct supplies to the spinal cord and there are indirect supplies. That means the motor cortex supplies to the nucleus, as in this case the reticular nuclei, and then these nuclei forms the cortico-reticulospinal tract, and indirectly the motor cortex is affecting the spinal cord through the reticular formation. So this is the example of other supplies of the motor cortex to other areas of the brain. Now there are incoming sensory fibers to the motor cortex also. There are supplies from the subcortical fibers from adjacent region also, like the visual cortex, the auditory, the vestibular cortex. These helps in the initiation and the planning of movement. Then comes the sensory fibers from corpus callosum. These fibers connect the two parts of the brain, the left and the right parts of the brain. Corpus callosum's main function is to connect the two parts of the brain, the left part of the brain to the right part of the brain, and the signals are coming to the motor cortex from corpus callosum about what the other part of the brain is doing. Then the sensory signals also comes from the thalamus to the motor cortex. Ventrobasal complex of the thalamus is responsible for the sensory input. The sensation, the skin sensation, the proprioception comes to the motor cortex through the ventrobasal complex of the thalamus. Then ventrolateral and ventroanterior nuclei are responsible for the input of basal ganglia and cerebellum to the motor cortex. And intralaminar nuclei is responsible for general activation of the motor cortex. So these are the incoming sensory fibers to the motor cortex. Now coming to the last topic of this video lecture is the corticobulbar tract, and there is also an assignment for you guys. We studied about the corticospinal tract, the descending corticospinal tract, the lateral, the anterior corticospinal tract. What is the corticobulbar tract? These are the tract which are arising from the same portion of the cortex, motor cortex, and supplying to the nucleus of the cranial nerves. As you can see here, the facial nerve nuclei. Okay, so the output to the body is through spinal cord, but to the face and to other areas which are supplied by the cranial nerves, not by the spinal nerves. Okay, the nerve arising from the spinal cord are the spinal nerves which supplies the rest of the body, but certain areas of the body is supplied not by the spinal nerves but by the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves, those nerves are arising from their nucleus, as in case you can see the facial nerve nucleus is present in the brain stem. So whichever the corticospinal tract which supplies to this nucleus are called corticobulbar tract. Corticobulbar tract. This will be the upper motor neuron for this corticobulbar tract, and from the nucleus this is the local circuitry, and from the nucleus arises the lower motor neuron which is then supplying the face, the muscles of facial expression. This is the corticobulbar tract. As you can analyze the different portion of your motor system in this individual diagram. The assignment for you guys is why there is different type of manifestation in different lesions. As you can see, upper motor neuron lesion is causing one type of manifestation and lower motor neuron lesion is causing another type of manifestation. Only in upper motor neuron the lower part of the face is involved, whereas in the lower motor neuron, in upper motor neuron, lower part of the face only is getting affected. The weakness is in the lower part of the face only, whereas in the lower motor neuron lesions the weakness is in the whole half of the face, that is upper part of the face as well as the lower part of the face. So the task for you guys is to comment below why is this happening, why is the lesions causing different manifestations. This is the corticospinal tract, descending tract. In next video we will discuss about the other descending tracts. Thank you for watching.